Chapter 41 of the Death Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Death Ship by William Clark Russell. Chapter 41. Imogene Fears for Me. On hearing that we were sailing to the coast, my delight was so keen that I came near to suffocating myself by the sudden checking of the shout of joy that rose to my throat, like an hysteric throttling thickness in the windpipe. I will not say that Vanderdecken did not observe the change in my countenance when he made his answer to Imogene, but whatever might have been his reflections, they were concealed by his frowning brow and the dark and stormy shadow of passion upon his face. He ceased to speak when she ceased to question, and went on deck without calling for his usual pipe of tobacco, which was a very remarkable illustration in him of his wrath and concern. "Dearest," said I, going to Imogene's side, "it has been a dark and cheerless night with you, I fear. Would to God it were this day in my power to give redness to the roses that now lie white in your cheeks. Yet this is great news that Vanderdecken has given us." She smiled in a questioning way. "Why," said I, answering her, "'tis very certain that we shall never escape from this death ship while she sails the seas. But though I could not here say for the life of me what the land may do for us, I feel that the coming to an anchor close to it may give us a chance, and it will go hard indeed if a sailor's cunning, sharpened by despair, does not contrive some remedy for this horrible enthrallment." She mused a little and said, "Geoffrey, I have made up my mind to this. If you can carry me away with you, I will go. Whatever resolution you may form will be mine, as shall be your fortune. But, dearest," said she, smiling to the grasp of her hand, "I am also determined that your liberty shall not depend upon my escape. If you are able to get away alone, but not with me, then I stay." "Ah," said I, shaking my head, "your gaze cannot have sunk very deep into me, or you would not talk thus." She put her finger upon my lip. "Geoffrey, consider this. You are a man. You are young. The world is before you. Liberty is your precious jewel. Nay, you have a home and a mother to return to. I am an orphan, lonely in this great world of water as any seabird that solitarily follows our ship. I sometimes feel that there is a cold hand on my heart, and that my time is not long. If it is to be my destiny to remain in this vessel, I am too certain of a short residence to fear it." She stopped suddenly and wept. We were alone, and I took her in my arms. I saw how it was with her, how the fear of the tempest, how sleeplessness had wrought in her delicate health and depressed her powers, and I comforted and cherished her as my heart's love best knew how. Yet her foreboding concerning her time in this world struck a chill into my blood, for it just then found solemn accentuation in her unusual pallor, her languid eyelids, the sadness of her smile, her low voice and tears. The weather brightened as the day advanced. By noon the sky had broken into lagoons of blue, with fine large clouds that rained here and there upon the horizon and filled the air down there with broken shafts of rainbow, like to windgalls, only that the colours were very sharp and even glorious. There was now plenty of sunshine to give life and splendour to the ocean, whose dye of azure looked the purer and more sparkling for its cleansing by the great wind and rain and firebolts of the past night. The swell of the sea was from the southward, no longer a turbulent movement, but a regular respiratory action, with weight and volume, yet that made you think of the deep as a sentient thing, with something of the violence of its hellish conflict yet lurking in its rhythmic breathing. About this hour a number of whales showed their black, wet backs at the distance of a mile. The sunshine turned their spoutings into very beautiful fountains, which fell in showers of diamonds and rubies and emeralds, and their great shapes and solemn movements, with now and again the dive of one with a breathless lingering of tail that showed like a gigantic fan of ebony, or the rise of another, floating its sparkling blackness above the violet fold of a brimming swell, as though a little island had been hove to the surface by some deep-sea convulsion, afforded Imogene and me some 20 minutes of very agreeable diversion. The wind was a trifle to the southward of west, a brisk breeze, and the ship swarmed and swirled and rolled along at a speed of some 5 or 6 marine miles in the hour, every cloth abroad and already dried into its usual dingy, staring tones. But the pump was worked without intermission. The clanging of the brake upon its pin, the gushing of the bright water flowing to the scuppers and flooding the deck thereabouts with every roll, the hissing of the slender cascades over the side, grew into sounds as familiar as the creaking of the bulkheads or the cries of the rudder upon its ancient rusty pintles. Those pumping gangs made a strange, mysterious sight. They toiled, but their labor was not that of living seamen, who changed their posture again and again, who let go an instant with one hand to smear the sweat from their brows, or to bite an end of tobacco, who break into choruses as they ply their arms, or growl out curses upon this hardest of marine tasks, or raise a cheerful call of encouragement one to another. There was the same soullessness in this as in all else they did. No dew was distilled from their death-like faces. Once at the pump, they never shifted their attitudes. A seaman of 70, and perhaps older yet, would work side by side with one of 20 years, and at the end of the hour's labor, for each gang was relieved every hour, the aged sailor would exhibit no more fatigue than the younger one. Their aspects came out startlingly as they stood close together, their countenances bearing expressions as undeterminable as the faint smile or the dim frown of horror, or the slumberous placidity on the features of the dead. And never was the sense of the wild conjecture of the Saracen's mad captain so borne into me as when I viewed one group after another coming to this pumping business, and contrasted their faces and perceived how every man, young, middle-aged, and old, showed in dreadful vitality the appearance he would have offered at the hour of his death, no matter his years, had the curse not stood between him and the grave. That afternoon, happening to be alone on the poop, I mean without Imogene, for when she was absent I was more alone, though the whole of that ship's grisly company had gathered around me, than ever I could have been if marooned on some mid-ocean rock, and listening a little to the monotonous beat of the pump gear, a thought came into my head, and I stepped over to Vanderdecken, who leaned upon the weather rail, his chin upon his hand. "Mynheer," said I ask your pardon for breaking in upon you. The labor of pumping is severe. I know it from several stern experiences." He lifted his head and slowly looked round to me. "The ship," I continued, "has rescued me from death and proved an asylum to me. 'Tis but right I should share in the general toil. Suffer me, then, mynheer, to take my turn at the pump with the others." He eyed me a little with his wonderful fiery gaze, and answered, "It is not necessary. Our company is numerous, and there are hands enough. Besides, sir, there is no urgency. The water doth not gain, if it do not decrease." I bowed and was leaving him, but he added, "I fear you have but an imperfect knowledge of the character of the Dutch. Yet you tell me you have often visited Rotterdam." "It is true, mynheer, but only as a sailor, liberated a nights, and forced, therefore, to form his judgment on such company as the alehouse supplies." "That seems so," said he. "Otherwise you would suspect from such treatment as we have shown you that we regard you as a guest, and it is not customary among us to use our guests as labourers." I bowed again, contenting myself with merely thinking how, as a guest, I went in fear of my life, to say no more. I thought, however, I would use his seeming willingness to converse with me, and said in as deferential a manner as I could command, "Sir, the mere circumstance of my being your guest should properly teach me to believe that a time must come when I shall have wearied your courtesy by imposing too great a burden of my company upon it." I paused, hoping he would make haste to assure me to the contrary, but he did not speak, merely eyeing me steadfastly. "You will therefore judge, mynheer," I continued, "that I am actuated by no idle motive of curiosity in asking you whether your present design is to steer the ship to a port." "To what port?" he exclaimed. I told him I did not know. "Nor I," said he. "What settlement is there on this seaboard? You do not suppose that, with yonder pump going day and night, I should be willing to head for any other point of the coast than the nearest bay in which to careen and get at the leak?" "Will that bay, mynheer," said I, still speaking with the utmost modesty and deference, "be far distant?" He answered, "It lies a few miles south of the parallel of 34 degrees. To reach it we shall have to sail 180 leagues." 540 miles! I exclaimed, with an involuntary dejected glance aloft at the passing water. "At this rate of progress, sir, the passage will occupy about 5 days." Our gaze met as I said this, and I observed a sudden fire in his eyes. "Does the execution of any project you have in your mind depend upon the time we will take in reaching the coast?" said he, with suspicion sounding fiercely in the rich, deep notes of his utterance. I felt the blood in my face as I answered, "Mynheer, I have no project. Methought if you sailed to a port, you would rid yourself of my company. I have been long in your ship. Every day increases my sense of trespass." Which said, I broke off, being really dismayed by the passionate fixity of his regard. Such a searching for the heart in one's face was unbearable. My imagination, perhaps my conscience, imparted a wizard-like power to his burning eyes, and I felt that if I lingered, I should be constrained into a revelation of my intention to escape with Imogene, as certain birds are fascinated into motionlessness and charmed to their devourment by the gaze of serpents. With the abruptness of alarm, I bowed and left him. As I walked, I could feel that his searching, scorching gaze followed me. However, it was something to have found out our whereabouts, to have gathered his intention, and to be able to calculate the time of our arrival off the coast. Of this I plumed myself, making pretty sure that if my questions had caused him to suspect some project in my mind, his memory would loose its hold of the thing after a few hours. But I was mistaken, as you shall now see. Whilst we were seated at the last meal of the day, and with us in that death ship formed of soup or wine for drink, and such victuals as remained from dinner, I observed a peculiar air of distress and anxiety in Imogene's face. I do not know that she made the least effort to disguise it. A sharp gleam of resentment would sparkle in the soft violet depths of her eyes, as she now and then turned them on Van Vogelaar or Vanderdecken, and then, as they came to me, they would soften into an exquisite wistfulness that was very near to a look of grievous pain. On the captain filling his pipe, I went on deck and stood out of sight on the cabin on the poop front, wondering what Imogene's manner signified. Presently she joined me. The sun was gone down. The stars shone singly or in clouds of bright dust over our northward-pointing bowsprit, and the air was soft and faint with the delicate light of the moon that was drawing out of her first quarter and that could now rain her pearls with power into the dark waters under her. "What is amiss, dearest?" said I, taking her hand in mine, and moved in a way I could not give expression to by the pallor of her face, her eyes showing large and dark, the paleness of lip and hair and throat. Her whole countenance, yes, and her figure too, stealing out of their realness into an elfin-like unsubstantiality to the wan complexion of the moon. She answered, Did not I tell you I was sorry you had questioned Vanderdecken? He is full of suspicion, and there is always Van Vogelaar at hand to exasperate his captain's temper and fancies by the poison of his own reptile nature." "Has Vanderdecken spoken to you of my questions?" "No," she replied. "What has happened is this. Half an hour before supper I was in my cabin. The air was close, and I put the door on the hook and was near it combing my hair. Vanderdecken came into the cabin and spoke to Prins. Soon afterwards Van Vogelaar entered and told the captain that he had been among the crew and informed them that he hoped to make the coast in 4 or 5 days, and that on their arrival in Amsterdam they would receive additional pay for their labour at the pump. They talked a little, but I should not have heeded them had not I suddenly caught the sound of your name. On this I left off combing my hair and crept close to the door. Vanderdecken said, 'I believe he hath some scheme.' He shrunk from my gaze, and the colour mounted to his cheeks. He quitted me with the air of one whose conscience is like an exposed nerve." "Heaven defend us!" I exclaimed. "Your true Dutchman is very fit to be a hangman. Yet this unholy creature did certainly look at me to some purpose. 'Twas time I walked off." She continued. Van Vogelaar answered, "I would not trust that man further away from me than my hand could seize him. Skipper, I ask your pardon, but was it wise, think you, to exhibit samples of the treasure below to this Englishman? There is a noble fortune for him in those chests, he could but come at it. What sort of egg is that which, beyond question, his mind is sitting upon, and which will be presently hatched? He is eager to learn your intentions, manifests this eagerness in defiance of the contempt and anger with which you have again and again crushed down his curiosity into the silence of terror. Suppose he hath some plot to secure the stranding of this ship, or that he intends her a mischief that shall force us to beach and perhaps abandon her. He is a sailor and an Englishman. We are Hollanders. Skipper, the like of that man needs no help from sorcery to contrive our ruin." Vanderdecken answered, "He must be got rid of," in a voice that showed how Van Vogelaar's talk worked in him. I did not need to look, Geoffrey, to know what sort of expression his face wore. They were silent a while. Vanderdecken then said, "'Twould be mere barbarous, useless murder to take his life. There is no evidence against him. But we have a right to protect ourselves, since he hath been mad and ungenerous enough to raise our suspicions." Van Vogelaar interrupted, "'Tis more than suspicion. 'Tis conviction with me, skipper." "This occurs to me as a remedy," said Vanderdecken. "He must be set ashore before we sail, but he shall not be left to starve. A musket and ammunition will provide him with food, and he shall have a week's provisions. He is young and has stout legs, and cannot miss his way to our settlement if he holds steadfastly to the coast." The mate said, "Aye, that will be dismissing him lovingly." They then went to the other end of the cabin and talked, but I could not hear them. "It would be barbarous, useless murder," I cried, "to hang or stab or drown me, but kindness, nay, lovingness, to set me ashore with a week's provisions and a fowling piece, to give me a night to be torn to pieces in by wild beasts, or a week to be enslaved by the Hamadods, or a month to perish of hunger. The villains! Is this to be their usage of me? Geoffrey, if they put you on shore, I will follow. The future that is good enough for you is good enough for me, and, indeed, I would rather die a hard death on shore than be left to miserably live with men capable of cruelly destroying you." I reflected a little and said, "Their resolution keeps me safe for the present, at all events. If I am to be marooned, they will let me alone meanwhile. Therefore I consider that their determination greatly improves our chances. No, there is nothing in their intention to scare me. I like their meaning so well that our prayer to God must be that Vanderdecken may not change his mind." She was at a loss to understand me until I pointed out that, as I gathered from her report, they would not send me ashore until just before they were about to sail, so that I should have plenty of time to look about me and consider the surest method of escaping, whilst the ship was being careened and the leak repaired and the vessel in other ways doctored. And, dearest, said I, it has come to this with you too, that sooner than remain with these fierce and dreadful people, you will take your chance of that African coast you so greatly feared. I will share your fortune, Geoffrey, be it life or death, let come what will, said she, nestling close and looking up at me out of the phantom faintness of her face, with her large eyes in whose liquid darkness the moon was reflected in 2 stars. My precious one, I could not leave thee. If the terrors of the shore, the fears of the savage, the wild beast, the poisonous serpent, triumphed over your desire of escape, I would remain with you, Imogene, if they would let me. 'Twould be a hard fate for us both, dearest, to wear out our lives in this ship. But we cannot be parted, not of our own will at least, however God may deal with us, or the knife or yard-arm halter of these villains. Wherever you are, I must be. Yes, she cried passionately. It may not indeed come to our delivering ourselves by using the coast. Another scheme is in my head, though of it I will say nothing, since too much of fortune must enter it to fit it for cold deliberation. But it may end in our escaping to the land, and lurking there in hiding till the ship sails, and it makes my heart feel bold, Imogene, to hear you say that sooner than languish and miserably end your days in this accursed fabric, you will dare with me the natural perils of that shore. End of chapter 41.
Chapter 42 of The Death Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hannah Newberry. The Death Ship by William Clark Russell. Chapter 42. Land. But for Imogene having overheard his conversation with Van Vogelaar, I should never have been able to guess that there was any change in Vanderdecken's resolution respecting me. I mean any change in his intention to carry me to Europe in his ship. There was the same uniformity in the variety of his moods. He was sullen, haughty, morose, often insanely fierce, sometimes talkative, then falling into trances, in all such exhibitions as heretofore. In Van Vogelaar, however, there was a slight alteration. At moments I caught him peering at me with a look in his eyes that might have answered very well as a dark, malicious merriment of soul, of which the countenance was capable of expressing the villainous qualities only. I mean, not the mirth also. Sometimes he would make as though to converse, but this I cut short, repelling him very fearlessly now that I understood his and his captain's plans. On my side, I was extremely wary, walking cautiously in all I said and did, and never venturing a remark to Imogene, even when we had reason to believe we were absolutely alone, without sinking my voice after a careful probing glance around as if I expected to see a human ear standing out on any beam or bulkhead my sight went to. I busied myself in certain preparations in which I got Imogene to help me. Since, in any case, our escape to the land would have to be profoundly secret, 'twas necessary we should get ready a small stock of food to carry away with us, and I told Imogene to make some bags out of the stoutest stuff she could come at to store it in, and to privately convey to me such provisions as I indicated, which she, as well as I, was to secrete when alone, during Prynne's absence when the table was prepared. I said, "You have needles and thread?" for she had told me that some of the apparel Vanderdecken lent or gave her she had been obliged to alter. "We shall require 3 or 4 bags. Linen will do for the material." "There is plenty of linen," she said. "I will make the bags. But what is your project, Geoffrey? Tell me your full scheme. I may be able to put something to it." "I have 2 schemes," I answered, "but I will speak only of the one that concerns the shore. Vanderdecken is sure to bring up close to the land. I have little doubt of being able to swim the distance, and shall make a small frame of wood to sit about your waist, on which you will float when I lower you into the water, and then I shall softly let myself down and tow you to the land by swimming." I thought to see her countenance change, but she regarded me fearlessly, indeed with an emotion as of triumph colouring her face. "How am I to enter the water?" she asked. "I will lower you from the quarter gallery outside your cabin," I replied. "The height is not great. The blackness under the counter will hide you, and I shall contrive to float us both away very quietly." She said, gazing at me fondly and smiling, "Everything is feasible so far, Geoffrey. But now imagine us arrived on shore." "I must carry you as far as your strength will suffer," I replied. "Of course Vanderdecken will send in pursuit of us, but there should be no lack of dense vegetation full of hiding places. Yet in this, as in all other things, my dearest, we must rely upon God's help. That given, there is nothing to fear. Denied, then it would be better for me if I threw myself overboard at once." "Geoffrey," she said, "I do not question you, dear heart, for dread of what we may encounter, but merely that by letting your plans lie in my mind, my girlish spirit may grow used to them and unswervingly help you when the time comes." "Brave little woman," I cried, "do not believe I could misjudge you. You would ask me what is to follow when this vessel quits the coast and leaves us alone here? How can I answer? We must attempt what others have successfully achieved, and struggle onwards to some settlement. I know, my darling, that the outlook is black and affrighting, but consider what our choice signifies, the fate that awaits us if you remain and I am marooned, or the chances, meagre indeed, but chances nevertheless, which offer if we escape to the land. And we shall be together, dearest. A sailor will wonder perhaps to hear me speak of 3 or 4 bags of provisions, and wonder also that I should not see that if there was the least movement in the water when I lowered Imogene with these bags about her into it, the provisions would be spoiled by the wet. But 'tis proper to say here that this proposal to float her in a frame and tow her ashore by swimming was but an alternative scheme which, at all hazards, I would go through with, if the other and less perilous venture should prove impracticable, and in case this should be so, I said nothing to her about it, that by her growing accustomed to the dismal and dangerous project she would not tremble and shrink if it came, as I feared it might, to our having to escape ashore. 3 small bags secured about my darling's shoulders, well out of the water, were less likely to be wetted than one big one that must needs hang low, trice it as I might. And anyway, the 3 would be as good as 1, let the manner of our escape be what it would. She made me these bags, and I hid them in my cabin, along with some biscuit which had been taken from the wreck, a few pieces of salted meat, cooked, a small jar of flour, a little silver cup for drinking, and other compact and portable things, such as the flat banana cakes the cook sent to the cabin, a bottle of marmalade the size of a small pickle jar, and the like. These things she and I took from the table by degrees, and they were not missed. I would have given a finger for a musket and powder and balls, but if there was an arms chest on board, neither she nor I knew where to find it. And suppose it had been possible for me to have secreted a musket. What they used, I believe, for shooting game and cattle were matchlocks with barrels about 3½ feet long, and a bore of the bigness of a horse pistol, and cartridges in small hollow canes, each holding a charge of powder. Ammunition was not to be had without asking. She stitched me 4 bags, but 3 I found, when filled, would be as heavy a load as it was prudent to put upon her, because when I came to look about me for wood for a frame for her to float in, I could only meet with 5 small pieces, and even the purloining of these was attended with prodigious anxiety and trouble, as you will judge when I say that to get them I had to watch till I was unobserved, and then kick a piece, as if by accident, under a gun, or to any corner where it might lie, until I could carry it below under cover of the night. All these things I hid under the bed-place in my cabin, where I had very little fear of their being found, for the good reason that, to my knowledge, no one ever entered the berth. Meanwhile the wind held bravely, with, on the 3rd day, but a few hours of stagnant atmosphere and a flat and brilliant sea, followed by a shift to the westward of south that worked into a hearty wind, before which the Death Ship drove under all cloths, the clear water gushing from her scuppers to the clanking and spouting of her pump. Bearing in mind our situation after the tempest, as given me by Vanderdecken, and narrowly, if furtively, observing the courses we made, I kept a dead reckoning of our progress, for by this time I could measure the vessel's pace with my eye as correctly as ever the log could give it, and when the 5th day arrived I knew that at 8 o'clock that morning either we were some 12 leagues distant from the African coast, or that Vanderdecken was amazingly wrong in his calculation. My excitement bade fair to master me. It needed a power of will such as I could never have supposed I possessed, to subdue my demeanour to that posture of calmness which the captain and his mates were used to see in me. Happily Imogene was at hand to control any exhibition of impatience or anxiety. "Let them suspect nothing in your manner," she would say. "Van Vogelaar watches you closely. The least alteration in you might set him conjecturing. Who knows what fancies his base and malignant mind is capable of? His heart is bent on your destruction, and though he hopes that must follow your being left alone on the coast, yet a change in your ordinary manner might fill his cruel soul with fear that you had some plan to escape with your life, in which case, I fear, Geoffrey, he would torment and enrage Vanderdecken into slaying you either here or on shore." Well, as I have said, at 8 o'clock that morning I reckoned we were some 12 leagues distant from the coast. The breeze had slackened somewhat, but it still blew a fresh air, and the water being quiet and such small swell as there was, together with the billows chasing us, our speed was a fair 5½ knots. Yet there was no sign to advertise us of the adjacency of land. A few cape hens flew along with us on our starboard beam, but this kind of sea-fowl had accompanied the ship when we were as far south as ever we were driven since I had been in her, and they could not be supposed to signify more than that we were off the South African coast headland, which term may stand for the measure of a vast extent of sea. The ocean was of as deep and glorious a blue as ever I had beheld it in the middle of the Atlantic. My suspense grew into torment, anxiety became anguish, the harsher and fiercer for the obligation of restraint. There was no dependence to be placed on Vanderdecken's reckoning. For several days he had been hove to, and his log would certainly neither tell him his drift nor how the current served him. My only hope then was in the supernatural guiding of the ship. I might believe, at least, that the instincts of the sea-bird would come to one whose dreadful and ghostly existence lay in an aimless furrowing of the mighty waters, and that he would know how to steer when the occasion arose, as does the ocean fowl whose bed is the surge as its pinion is its pillow, but whose nest must be sought in rocky solitudes, leagues and leagues below that sea-line in whose narrow circle you find the creature flying. I dared not seem to appear to stare earnestly ahead. The part I had to play was that of extreme indifference, yet swift as were the looks I directed over either bow, my eyes would reel with the searching, passionate vehemence of my stare, and the blue horizon waved to my sight as though it swam upon a swooning view. Shortly after 12 o'clock, I was standing alone on the forward end of the poop, when I observed a clear shade of blue haze upon the horizon directly ahead. I watched it a little while, believing it no more than a darkening in the dye of the sky that way. But on bringing my eyes to it a second time, I found a fixity in the atmospheric outlining of the shadow that was not to be mistaken for anything but the blue faintness and delicate dim heads of a distant hilly coast. I turned with a leap of heart that was a mingling of rapture and dread, to win Imogene by my manner, to view the land too, but she stood with Vanderdecken near the tiller, with her back upon me, apparently watching the motions of a bird that steadily flew along with us, some 3 cable lengths on our larboard quarter, flying no faster than we sailed, yet going through the air as straight as a belated homeward-bound rook. One of the men forward saw the azure shadow, and seemed to call the attention of 2 or 3 others to it in that voiceless, mechanical way, which furnished a ghostlier and grislier character to the bearing and movements of the crew than ever they could have taken from the paleness of their faces and the glittering, unreal vitality of their eyes only. And they went towards the beak to look, dropping whatever jobs they might have been upon, with complete disregard of discipline. Broad as the day was, abounding as the scene with the familiar and humanizing glory of the blessed golden sunshine and the snow-topped peaks of shallow liquid sapphire ridges, yet the figures of those men, showing under the swelling and lifting foot of the foresail, peered under the sharp of their hands against their foreheads, silent in posture of phlegmatic observation, gave the whole picture of the ship a wild and dismal colour and appearance, and the black melancholy, the cold unholiness of it, stole biting as polar frost smoke to the senses through the genial splendour of the noontide. Yet like those men did I stand looking with my hand against my brow, for there was a wonderful and almost blinding magnificence of light upon the shivering waters under the sun that was now floated north, but the resplendent haze did not dim the substantial line that was growing with a deepening hue into the atmosphere. And already, methought, I could discern the curve and sweep of inland airy altitudes with the dainty silver of clouds streaking them. "Land, Herr Fenton!" cried a voice in my ear. I started. Van Vogelaar stood close beside me, pointing with a pale leathern forefinger, his harsh and rugged face smileless, though his eyes grinned with malice as they lay fastened upon mine. "I see it, mein Herr," I replied coldly. "It should rejoice your English soul," he exclaimed. "Your countrymen will not count you as a mariner of theirs if you love not the land. See, remote and faint though it be, how substantial even in its blue thinness doth it show. No sea-sickness there, Herr Fenton, no hollow seas yawning black as vaults." Had this man been of the earth, I needed but to catch him by the scruff and breech and bring his spine to my knees to kill him. And he looked so much as if I could have served him so, that it was hard to regard him without pity. I said quietly, "Will that be the land the captain desires to make?" "Aye," he answered snarlingly, "the Dutch are sailors." I thought to myself, yes, when they have the devil for a sea cunny, they will hit their port. "You will be glad to step ashore, if but for half an hour?" he said, looking at me. "That is a matter that concerns your master," I answered, turning from him. A low ha broke from him, muffled as the sound of a saw worked under deck, as musical too, and as mirthless. Yet Imogene's quick ear caught it, and she turned swiftly to look, and methought it had penetrated further yet, for upon the heels of it there rose up as an echo from the cabin that harsh and rusty cry, "We zijn al verdoemd." End of chapter. Chapter 43 of the Death Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hannah Newberry. The Death Ship by William Clark Russell. Chapter 43. We bring up in a bay. I could not at that time know what part of the South African coast was this we had made, but I have since learnt that it lies a few miles to the eastward of the meridian of 22 degrees, and about 160 miles from Cape Agulhas. When it first came into sight, as I have said, it was but a faint, long-drawn shade in the light blue of the sky over the horizon, with such a fairy tincture of flaking eminence beyond that the whole was as delicately tender as the visionary shore of a dream. But before the dinner hour had come round, we had stolen nearly 2 leagues closer to it, and the coast lay plain enough and very brave with colours, the green of several dyes, the mountain skylines of an exquisite clearness of cutting in the radiant atmosphere, and against the hard azure brilliance of the heavens, and the tracts of white sand low down as luxurious as the foam of a dissolving surge. Soon after the land had hove into view, Imogene joined me. She had kept her feelings under whilst near Vanderdecken. Now, by my side, she stood with 20 emotions working in her, her nostrils quivering, her lips pale, the colour coming and going in her cheeks, the bright light that a passing hope flashed into her eyes, dying out to the tearful shadowing of some bitter fear. I said to her, very softly, and keeping my face as expressionless as my inward agitation would permit, for Vanderdecken and his mates conferred together near us, sometimes stopping close, sometimes stepping. If this pace holds, our anchor should be down by dusk. "What will they do?" she asked. "I have been asking that question of myself," I replied. "Were they human, of this earth, I could foretell their movements. No sooner were they come to an anchor than they would turn to and get the guns and cargo over to one side, that by listing the ship they might bring the leak out of water and save themselves this starving job of pumping. But we have to base conjecture upon men who are neither dead nor alive, who are Dutchmen besides. I mean of a dull and apathetic habit, and they may wait for daylight, and so obtain rest, of which they should get as much as they want with the reliefs they are able to send to the pump. What should best fit your project, Geoffrey?" "Oh," I said under my breath, "if we are to escape we shall need a deserted deck and a sleeping ship." "If this should come about tonight, will you make the venture?" "I cannot tell. Put it thus. If they shift the cargo after coming to an anchor with the idea of raising the leak clear, the work may occupy them all night. So all night long the ship will be alive and busy, and there will be no chance for me." "But the ship will also be alive if they continue to ply the pump, which must be done if she is not to sink." "Yes," said I, "so I may have to wait till tomorrow night." She cried, with a quick blanching of her face that cruelly proved her stock of strength but slender, "If they careen the ship tonight, they will be able to repair the leak in the morning and be ready to sail before the evening." I do not fear that. Yet it might happen, Geoffrey. They will put you on shore before sailing. She stopped, bringing her hands together with a passionate clasp. I do not fear that, said I again. Much will depend on where the leak is. If it be low down, they may not be able to come at it without discharging cargo, which, seeing that they have but those 2 boats yonder to work with, and that they will have to make tents ashore, and protect themselves against the native, if any there here be, should keep them on the move for a long month. No, dearest, I do not fear that they will get away by tomorrow night, not if they were 10 times as numerous and as nimble. Nor is it probable that Vanderdecken would suffer me to be marooned till the ship is ready to start. My one anxiety is just now the weather. There is tranquillity in that dark blue sky over us. The wind weakens as we approach the land, and there is promise of a calm night. May God help me to achieve my purpose before another 12 hours have rolled by. She looked at me with eagerness and alarm. "Tonight?" she cried. "If the ship lies here for days, as you imagine, how, when we are ashore, dare we hope to escape the strenuous search Vanderdecken is certain to make for us?" I smiled. She continued with a feverish whisper, "Consider, dearest, if we are captured, he will have your life. God knows into what barbarities his rage may drive him." "Dearest," said I gently, "let us first get out of the ship." And here we broke off, for our whispering had lasted long enough. Soon after this we went below to dinner. At the start we none of us spoke, our behaviour and perhaps our appearance answering very exactly to the poet's description of a party in a parlour who sat, all silent and all damned. Outside the sun shone gloriously, and the blue air had the purity of polished glass, but only a small portion of light found admission through the small windows in the cabin front, and we ate, and gazed upon one another in a sullen atmosphere as gloomy as the expression on Vanderdecken's face. At this moment I see him plain, as on that day, his beard falling to his waist, his head slightly bowed, his glance travelling in a gaze that would often stop and become fixed, his skin bleak and high and drawn with pallor. He was attired in a sort of blouse of dark green cloth, confined about his waist by a yellow belt fastened by a small metal clasp that would have given him a romantic and buccaneering look but for the austere majesty and fateful character of his appearance, which inevitably neutralized every suggestion that did not accord with the solemn, horrible mystery of his being. We sat for some time, as I have said, as silent as the dead, but on reflecting that there was nothing in reason I could say likely to procure me a harder fate than that already designed by these men, I determined to ask a question or two, and said, "Has your carpenter ascertained in what part of the ship the leak is, Mynheer?" He turned his eyes round upon me slowly. He was indeed stately in all he did. I never beheld him glance quickly nor start, and the only time in which his dignity fell torn in rags from him was the night when he acted over the scene of the curse in his sleep. He answered, "Yes." "Is it far down?" said Imogene. "The ship will need heeling to 4 strakes," he replied. I dropped my knife onto the deck for the excuse to pick it up that I might hide the delight in my face. A list of 4 strakes would prove but a very small matter to bring about, and my fears that the vessel would linger for days, perhaps a month, on this coast vanished. "I hope," said I, "that it may not prove worse than a started butt end." "It is that, and no more," said he. "How much more would you have, Herr Fenton?" exclaimed Van Vogelaar in his ugliest manner. "Dost suppose our pump can deliver half the great South Sea with every stroke?" "It should take us 4 days of easy working," said I, "to careen, repair, and start afresh snugly stowed." "You are in a hurry to get home, sir, no doubt?" exclaimed Van Vogelaar. "Sir," said I am addressing the captain." "Skipper," cried the man, "Herr Fenton is in a hurry to get home. We should put him in the way of making a speedy passage." "I expect to return in this ship," said I, speaking with my eyes on Vanderdecken. "I am well satisfied. Nothing stauncher floats. Consider, Mynheer, how nobly she has acted in the gales we have encountered. It would please me to entreat you to use such poor skills as I have as a mariner in helping your men. But your courtesy is magnanimous, of the form that is to be met in the highest perfection in the Hollander of lineage, and I will not risk my own civility by further requests." He motioned with his hand, contenting himself with whatever answer the gesture signified. I perceived there was no further information to be obtained from him. From Van Vogelaar nothing but sneers and insults, so I held my peace. Yet I had learned something. When, after dinner, I went on deck, the land looked as near again as it had when I went below. This was owing to the amazing transparency and purity of the atmosphere, insomuch that every 20 fathoms the ship measured was like adding a fresh lens to a perspective glass. Yet it was not until 4 o'clock that the coast lay so clear as to render every detail of it a visible thing. And then the sight was helped by the sun being on the larboard side and showering his glory aslant, which, mingling with the golden splendor rising out of his wake in the sea, put an extraordinary shining into the atmosphere, but without the lustrous haze that had been rising when he was right over the land and kindling the water under our bows. 'Twas a picture of a bay with a shelving beach thickly green with bushes and trees, in and out of which there winded links and lines of exceeding white sands that trembled to the sunshine with the shivering metallic sheen of frosted silver. The sea went blue as the sky to the shore and tumbled in foam, in some places leaping up in creamy dartings, in others making a small crystal smoke with its boiling, elsewhere lapping tenderly and expiring in ripples. The azure heights beyond, which had seemed to closely flank the coast when first beheld, drew inland with our approach, marking their remoteness by the retention of their lovely atmospheric delicacy of colour, and their height by the length of vapour that clung to their mighty slopes at various altitudes, like fragments of great silken veils or cloths of pale gold, which had been rent whilst blowing along. The seaboard went in a rugged line east and west by the compass, sometimes coming very low down, sometimes soaring into great forelands, plentifully covered with wild growths, as you saw by the several dyes of green that coated it, and in one place, about a league from the bay, a pale blue smoke rising up denoted a bush-fire, and, as it was easy to suppose, the presence of natives. The sky was catching a tinge of brassy hardness from the westering sun, and the complexion of it, where the mountain heights were, somehow made you think of measureless miles of hot and cloudy sand glowing yellowly up into the feverish reflection. The weak swell that lifted us rolled in wind-wrinkled folds into the bay, which yawned unsheltered to the south. I knew from experience that it needs no great wind on this coast to raise a monstrous sea, and it was with unspeakable eagerness and anxiety that I directed my eyes from the land to the sky overhead and on our quarters. But the promise of tranquillity seemed to deepen with the drawing down of the sun. It was sheer sapphire in the south, melting eastwards into violet, and the sea that way was like an English lake, and to the left of the sun there floated a few purple clouds, which I watched some time with attention, but could not tell that they moved, though a breeze was still about us, humming pleasantly aloft, keeping our old sails rounded, and sending the aged structure gliding at 4 knots an hour, as quietly through it as a seagull paddling in the level water of a harbour. But for the tedious clanging of the pump and the fountain sounds of its discharge, the stillness on board would have been as deep as the hush upon the land. Still, lovely as was that afternoon, I very well remember wishing it had been a month earlier or later than this. We were in the stormy time of the year in these parts, though it was summer at home, and a violent change might come quickly. If it came, Vanderdecken would have to put to sea, leak or no leak, for it was not to be supposed that mere hemp could partake of the curse. And the cables which I saw some of the crew getting up out of the hold and bending to the anchors at the bows were assuredly not going to hold this lump of a craft high out of the water and as thick as a tower aloft for 20 solid minutes in a seaway and in the eye of a stout wind. Therefore it was, when I was alone with Imogene, the coast being then about a league distant and the sun low, that I said to her, "Dearest, I have made up my mind to make a desperate effort to get away with you tonight." "I am ready," she answered instantly. "You need but tell me what to do." "We must make use of this noble weather," I continued. "It is a fickle season. A change may come in 6 hours and force Vanderdecken to sea with his pump going. Imogene, it must not find us aboard." "No." "There will be no moon till 11. We must be away before she rises, for she will glow brightly in that sky." "Dearest, I am ready," she repeated. "But, Geoffrey, risk nothing on the mere chance that the weather will change. You might imperil your life by haste, and tomorrow night may be as reposeful as this that approaches, and with a later moon too." "Yes, but do not bid me risk nothing," I exclaimed. "We must risk everything, our chances aboard and our chances out of ship, or you are as good as chained to this vessel for life." She smiled her acquiescence. I looked at her with passionate inquiry, but never did a braver or more resolved heart gaze at a lover from a maiden's eyes. I found the fearlessness of her devotion the more admirable for the dread she had expressed concerning the perils of the coast, and for her speaking thus to me with the land close to, and all its wildness and melancholy visible to her, together with the distant smoke, toward which I had seen her glance again and again, and whose meaning she perfectly understood. The ship swam slowly forwards. The coast dried the wind out of the atmosphere, but so much the better, for there was enough to carry us in, and then it could not die too soon to serve my turn. All was ready with the anchors forward, and the men hung about in pallid gangs, waiting for orders to take sail off the ship. The vitality of the wondrous craft seemed to lie in the pump and its automatic pliers, so deep was the silence among the crew and so still their postures. But now and again the heavy courses would swing into the mast to the soft bowing of the fabric, and raise a feeble thunder note like to the sound of bowls rolling over hollow ground. The red light in the west lay upon the head of the shaggy line of coast, and the far-off mountains that had been blue went up in a dim purple to the sky. The crimson haze seemed to float over the rugged brink, and roll down the slope to the shore, so that the scene was bathed in a most exquisite, delicate light, all features touched with red, a bronze as of English autumn upon the green, the white sand gleaming rosily, and great spaces of reddish rubble-like ground glowing dark as blood. But the loneliness! I figured myself ashore there, the ship gone, Imogene gone. I stood in fancy upon the beach looking out on this bare sea, an aged, perhaps worthless firelock by my side, a few cartridges, a week's store of provisions. The moan of the surf was in my ear. Every creaking and rustling of the wind in the near bushes startled me. To the right and left rolled the coast for endless leagues, and the vast plain of sea, whose multitudinous crying found echoes in 1,000 caverns, east and west, and in the reverberating heart of giant cliffs whose walls were best measured in parallels and meridians, went down into the heavens where the utmost ends of the earth were. Yet hideous as was the prospect of that shore when I thought of myself marooned upon it, its horror shrank into mere perils, such as courage, patience, and resolution might overcome, when my imagination put my darling by my side, and with her hand in mine I looked round me upon the vast scene of solitude. In her weakness I found my strength, in her devotion my armor. Great God, how precious to man is thy gift of woman's love! But for Imogene, where would have been my purpose and determination? I have but to recall the condition of my spirits when I looked at the shore and thought of myself as alone there to know. The sun had been sunk an hour, the twilight had melted into darkness, and the sky was full of stars, when the Death Ship floated in a breathless manner to abreast of the eastern bluff or foreland of the bay, and with an air as faint as the sigh of a spirit expiring upon the black drapery of her higher canvas, she slided the blotting head of coast on to her quarter and came to a dead stand within half a mile of the beach. I heard Vanderdecken tell Arentz to drop the lead over the side. This was done. The captain exclaimed, "What trend hath she?" "None, sir. The line is up and down like an iron bar." "Clew up the topsail and topgallant sails. Up with the courses. See all ready to let go the anchors, Van Vogelaar." These orders were re-echoed. In a moment the decks were alive with dusky shapes of moving men. One after another the sails dissolved against the stars like clouds, amid the hoarse rumbling of blocks, the whistling of running rope, and the rattle of descending yards. "Are you all ready forward?" cried Vanderdecken, his rich voice going in notes of deep-throated music up into the gloom. "All ready," answered Van Vogelaar from the forecastle. "Then let go the anchor." The heavy splash of a great weight of iron was followed by a hot seething sound of cable torn through the hasp-pipe. The water boiled to the launching blow from the bow and spread out in a surface of dim green fire. I watched to see if the vessel would swing, but there was no air, neither was there tide or current to slew her, and she hung in a shadow like that of a thundercloud over her own anchor, her mastheads very softly beating time to the slow lift and fall of the light swell. "Keep all fast with the larboard anchor," exclaimed Vanderdecken. "Overhaul the cable to the 50-fathom scope. Aloft, men, and stow the canvas. Carpenter!" A hoarse voice answered, "Sir." "Sound the well, and let me know what water there is." In a few minutes a lanthorn flickered like an ignis fatuus, and threw out the sombre shapes of men as its gleam passed over the decks, which rippled in faint sheets of phosphoric light. He who bore it was the carpenter. When he came to the pump, he handed it to a seaman whilst he dropped the sounding rod down the well. The light was yellow, and the figures of the fellows who were pumping and the stooping form of the carpenter stood out of the gloom like an illuminated painting in a crypt. A foot or two of water gushing from the pump sparkled freely to where the darkness cut it off. Against the glittering lights in the sky you saw the ink-like outlines of men dangling upon the yards, rolling up the canvas. I watched the carpenter pore upon the rod to mark the height to which the wet rose. He then came on to the poop and spoke to Vanderdecken in a voice too low for me to catch what he said. Imogene had left me 10 minutes before, and I stood alone in the deeper shade made in the gloom upon the poop by the mizzen rigging. The beating of my heart was painful with anxiety, From one moment to another I could not tell what the next order might be, and if ever I seemed to feel a breath of air upon my hot temples, I trembled with the fear that it would be the forerunner of a breeze. As it stood, 'twas such a night to escape, and that my deepest faith in God's mercy had never durst rise my hope to the height of its beauty and stillness. On the opposite side of the poop slowly walked Vanderdecken. In the starlight such of his skin as showed was as white as wax. He sometimes looked aloft at the men there, sometimes around at the ocean, sometimes coming to a stand to mark the gradual swinging of the ship that was now influenced by some early trickling of tide, or by the motions of the small heaving in the sea, or by some ghostly whispering of air overhead. 10 minutes passed. Though the ship was full of business, not a sound broke from the men, and the hush you felt upon the dark line of shore would have been upon the vessel, but for the clanking jerks of the pump brake and the noise of flowing water. A figure came up the poop ladder and softly approached. It was Imogene. I lightly called, and she came to my side in the shadow. "What are they doing?" she asked. "They are furling the sails, nothing more as yet," I answered. "Will they endeavour to lift the leak out of the water tonight?" "Dearest, I am waiting to see what they mean to do." "I will ask Vanderdecken," said she. "He always answers my questions." I seized her hand. "No, he may suspect I sent you. Let us walk carelessly here and there. Lurking in the shadows might give an air of conspiracy to the prattle of infants to the suspicions of a mind such as his." We moved towards the taffrail. The helm was lashed and abandoned, and then quietly to and fro, speaking under our breath. "Geoffrey, we may find no water to drink when we get on shore. Have you provided for that?" she said. I started. I had thought of all things, as I fancied, yet I had overlooked the most essential of our certain needs. "No, I have not provided for that," I exclaimed. "How now to manage?" "I thought of it just now in my cabin. There is a pitcher there, and the sight of it put it into my head to ask if you had included water in your stock of provisions. It holds about 2 gallons. It has a narrow neck and may be easily corked. But how can we convey it ashore? My weight and the bags and it would sink a bigger frame than the one that is to float me." I said, "Is there fresh water in it?" "It is nearly full. Prinz keeps it replenished." I said, "Are bottles to be had?" She reflected and answered, "There are jars in which wine is kept, but I do not know where to find them." 'Twas my turn to think. I then cried, "There is a silver flagon in the box under the table, that which Prinz took away last week and brought back filled with sherry for Vanderdecken. Can you get it?" "Yes." "We may not need it. If so, we will leave it. Vanderdecken shall not say that we have plundered him, though we must risk a graver charge even than that, if there be occasion. Dearest, convey that flagon to your cabin. Fill it with fresh water in readiness. We shall find fresh water sweeter than the richest wine. Also, contrive to have the pitcher filled to the brim. Prinz will do that and suspect nothing. You will invent a reason, and when it is filled, cork it as securely as possible, and bind the head with stout rag, that what you use as a cork may not fall out." She said she would go and set about it at once. "A moment," I whispered. "Is the window of your quarter gallery open?" "No, but I will open it." "Do so. Stand at it till you hear me cough. Then grasp a rope that I will let hang against the window, and coil it away as you pull it in." She understood me with the readiness of a sailor's child and a sailor's sweetheart, and left me. The mizzen yard was lowered. The sail had been stowed some time. Rove through a small block at the end of the yard was a length of thin line termed signal halyards, used for the showing of colours. I waited till Vanderdecken came to a stand at the head of the ladder that was, of course, at the forward end of the poop. and then with the mariner's swiftness overhauled the hillards through the block, catching the end as it fell, that it might not strike the deck, and threw it over the quarter, coughing distinctly as I did so. I felt her pull it. I paid it out cautiously, narrowly watching Vanderdecken till the whole length was gone, then sauntered forward to where the shadow of the mizzen-rigging blackened the air. I had not stood there a minute when Vanderdecken cried out, "Van Vogelaar!" The mate answered from the forecastle, "Let a hand remain on the main topsail yard to receive a tackle for hoisting out both boats." I turned my back, putting both my hands to my face in an ecstatic burst of gratitude to the great God of heaven for this signal mercy. 'Twas what I had been hoping and waiting for, with a heart sickened by doubt and fear. The order was given, and had I been suddenly transported with Imogene into a ship bound for England, my soul could not have swelled up with
Chapter 44 of The Death Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Death Ship by William Clark Russell. Chapter 44. The Weather Helps My Scheme. I will say now that the alternate scheme I had all along had in my mind was escaping by means of one of the boats. But I had held this project back from Imogene, nay, had kept it in hiding almost away from my own consideration, for fear that I should be unable to secure a boat. Perhaps, indeed, I had counted upon Vanderdecken practicing the custom of his day, which was to get the boats over on coming to an anchor. Yet it was but a hope, and not daring to think too heartily in this direction, I had talked wholly to Imogene of delivering ourselves by floating and swimming ashore. But now the boats were to be lifted over the side, and my next proceeding must therefore be to watch an opportunity to enter one of them with Imogene and silently sneak away. To see what they were about, the men hung several lanterns about the waist and gangways. The canvas had been furled, and the yards lay in thick black strokes against the stars. The coast looked like peaked heights of pitch, and the sea, with a sort of dead gleaming floating in it with the motion of the folds, spread out brimful to the dim flashing of the surf. You could hear nothing for the noise of the pumping, yet it seemed to me but for that, God knows what mysterious whisperings, what faint noise of howling cries, what strange airy creeping of hisses and the seething of swept and disturbed foliage and burrowed bush I might catch the mingled echo of, hovering in a kind of cloud of sound, and coming, some of it, from as far away as the deeper blackness that you saw in the land where the cerulean giants of the afternoon steadied their burdened postures by pressing their brows against the sky. There was a red spot upon that part of the coast, over which you would be looking for the crimson forehead of the moon presently. 'Twas a league off, and expressed a big area of incandescence, and was the fire whence the smoke I had noticed arose. One after the other, they swung the boats clear of the rail to the water, and secured the ends of their painters, or the lines by which they were fastened, to a pin on either quarter, thus leaving both boats floating under the counter. Vanderdecken then gave orders for the second anchor to be let go, the ship having some time since slided imperceptibly back to the fair tension of the cable already down. I now thought I had been long enough on deck, that further lingering must suggest too much persistency of observation, so I went to the cabin. It was empty. I coughed, and in a minute or two Imogene came from her berth. The lamp swung over the table, and the white light that fell through the open bottom of it streamed on my face. She instantly exclaimed, "You are flushed and look glad. What is it, Geoffrey?" "We are as good as free," I cried. She stared at me. Then I explained how Vanderdecken had ordered the boats over, as though in sober truth he had as great a mind as I that we should escape, how our deliverance by one of the boats had been my second but concealed scheme, how both boats were under the counter, to our hands almost, and how nothing more remained to be done but wait a chance of entering one of them and dropping hiddenly out of sight. "Then we need not land," she cried. I said no. She clasped her hands and looked at me with a rapture that made me see how heavy, though secret, had lain the horror of escape by the shore upon her. I said to her, "Slip into your quarter gallery and look over and tell me which boat lies under it, whether the little or the large one. Also, if the rope that holds her is within reach. Also, distinguish what furniture of oars and sails are in the boats, if any there be. I dare not go to your cabin lest Vanderdecken should arrive as I come out." She went and was gone about 5 minutes. During this interval I took notice of a sobering down of the movements of the men about the deck, as though they were coming to an end with their various jobs of coiling away and clearing up. But the pump gushed incessantly. I grew extremely eager to know if they meant to handle the cargo and guns towards careening the vessel that night. But whether or no, I was determined to leave the Death Ship, and before the moon rose, if possible. 'Twas now a little after 7 o'clock. Imogene returned. She glanced about her to make sure I was alone, and seating herself close to me said, "It is the bigger boat that is under my quarter gallery." "Good," I cried. "She will be the safer for our purpose. Where the other boat lies the gloom is so thick 'tis impossible to see what is in her, but I can distinctly perceive the outline of a sail in the big boat." "There will be a mast as well," said I. "Since the sail is there, she will have been lowered fully equipped. And the rope that holds her?" "It tightens and droops with the lifting of the boat and the heaving of the ship," she replied, "but I think it may be grasped by standing upon the rail of the galley." This I had expected, for the boat rode to a very short scope of line. "Now, dearest," said I, "this is my plan. The line you dragged in, when middled and doubled, will serve me to lower you down with. When in the boat, you must throw the line off you, so that I may use it to send down the pitcher of water and the bags of provisions. I will then come down by it myself. Retire as early as you may under pretence of being weary. Then clothe yourself in your warmest attire, and select such apparel as fits most closely, for flowing drapery cannot but prove troublesome. Leave your cabin door unlatched, but seemingly shut, that I may enter by pushing only. Meanwhile, stay here. I shall return in a few minutes." I walked to my cabin below. The gang of pumpers clove to the break like a little company of spectres clothed as seamen, and their manner of toiling suggested a horrid mockery of the labor of earthly beings. I shot a swift glance along the deck ere descending the hatch, but, saving the men who pumped, could see no more than a shadow or two moving in the distance forward. I took the bags of provisions from under the bed. The smallest of the 3 fitted my hat, which I put on my head. The other 2 I crammed into my coat pockets, which were extremely capacious. A goodly portion of the bag in the larboard pocket stood up, and the head of the other was very visible, but I covered them by keeping my arms up and down, and so conveyed them to the cabin, which I surveyed through the door before entering. Imogene instantly took them to her berth and then returned. She had scarce resumed her seat when Vanderdecken entered. He came to the table and looked on a moment, and said, "Imogene, where is Prinz?" "I have not seen him," she answered. He stepped to the door and called, and then came to his chair and seated himself, not offering to speak till Prinz arrived. "Get the supper," said he. "Mix a bowl of brandy punch. My limbs ache. I have stood too long." Encouraged to address him by his breaking the silence, I said, "Mynheer Vanderdecken, may I ask if it is your intention to careen tonight?" He looked at me sullenly and with a frown, and said, "Why do you inquire?" "That I may crave a favour, sir. My cabin is close to the pump. The clattering of that engine is extremely disturbing, and therefore I would ask your permission to use this bench for a bed tonight if you do not intend to careen to the leak, and so render further pumping unnecessary." He considered a while, eyeing me sternly, but it was not conceivable that he should find any other than the surface meaning in this request. He answered, "I do not intend to careen. The weather hath every promise of continued fairness. The men shall have their night's rest. They will work the more briskly for it tomorrow. As the pump must be kept going, your request is reasonable. You can use this cabin, and Prinz shall give you one of my cloaks to soften your couch." I made him a low, grateful bow, secretly accepting his civility, however, as does a man condemned to death the attentions of a jailer or the tenderness of the hangman. Prinz prepared the table for supper, and then set a bowl of steaming punch before the captain. Shortly afterwards arrived Van Vogelaar and Arents. Our party was now complete, and we fell to. I said, "Gentlemen, you will forgive the curiosity of an English mariner who is unused to the discipline of the Batavian ships. How, Mynheer Vanderdecken, are the watches among you arranged when in harbour, as in a sense we may take ourselves now to be?" Imogene, observing my drift, came to my help and said in Dutch, "The practice is as with our countrymen here, Fenton." "Then the commandant stands the watch till midnight, and the mates together till sunrise," said I, speaking inaccurately that I might draw them into speech. "No," exclaimed Arents, "with us the commander keeps no watch. The mates take the deck as at sea, I till midnight, Van Vogelaar till 4, then I again." "That is as it should be," said I, smiling into Arents' large, fat, white face. "And it is very proper," said Van Vogelaar, in his coarse, sarcastic voice, "that English sailors should apply to the Dutch for correct ideas on true marine discipline." "Gentlemen," said I, suavely, "I have learnt much since I have been with you." The mate darted one of his ugliest looks at me, and it was made infernal by the twist of leering triumph in his heavy lips, though he could not suppose I exactly understood what it meant. We fell silent. Vanderdecken served out the punch with a small silver goblet. I drank but a mouthful or two, dreading the fumes. The others quaffed great draughts, making nothing of the potency of the liquor, nor of the steaming heat of it. Had they been as I was, or Imogene, human and real, I should have rejoiced in their intemperance, but 'twas impossible to suppose that the fumes of spirits could affect the brains of men immortal in misery. When they had done eating, they called for pipes, and Vanderdecken told Prinz to bring him such and such a cloak, naming and describing it. The fashion of it was about 80 years old. 'Twas of very dark velvet, with a silver chain at the throat and silk undersleeves. He motioned to Prinz to put it down, giving me to know by the same gesture that it was at my service. I thanked him with a slight inclination of the head, grateful that he did not speak, as I knew not what effect the news of my desire to sleep in the cabin might have upon the malignant mate's suspicious mind. Presently Arents put down his pipe and went on deck. Van Vogelaar, leaning on his elbow midway across the table, muttered with the long shank of his pipe between his teeth to Vanderdecken about the routine and rotation of the pumping gangs. The captain let fall a few instructions touching the morning's work. Imogene rose. "I am like you, Captain Vanderdecken, weary," she said, smiling, whilst her pale face fully warranted her assurance. "I shall go to bed." "'Tis early," said he, sending a look at the clock. "You seem dispirited, my dear. It will not be this brief halt here, I trust. We shall be under way again in a couple of days, homeward bound. One great ocean already traversed. Think of that." She put her fingers to her mouth, simulating a yawn. "But if you are weary," he continued, "go to rest, my dear." She smiled at him again, curtsied to me, and with a half bow to Van Vogelaar, went to her cabin. Vanderdecken, dipping the silver goblet into the punch bowl, bade me extend my cup. I thanked him, said my head ached, and that with his leave I would take the air above for a spell. On gaining the poop, I walked right aft and looked over the taffrail. The boats there rose and fell in two lumps of blackness under the quarters. They strained very quietly at the lines which held them, and this enabled me to observe, by noting the trend of the land, that such surface motion as the water had was westerly. I was fretted to observe the sea unusually phosphorescent. Every time the rise and fall of the ship's stern flipped at one or the other of the boat's lines, the sudden drag raised a little foam about her, and the bubbling flashed like the reflection of sheet lightning in a mirror. This, I say, vexed me, for the dip of an oar must occasion a fire as signalling in its way as a flare or a lantern, though the boat itself should be buried in the darkness. I came away from the taffrail after a very brief look over. Arents, at the head of the poop ladder, stood apparently gazing at the men pumping on the main deck, but I knew the motionless postures into which he and the others fell too well to guess that any speculation would be found in his eyes, could they be peered into. The bush fire burnt like a great red spark on the black outline to starboard. Out of the western ocean the stars looked to be floating as though they were a smoke of silver sparkles meeting in a mass of diamond light over our swaying mastheads, with scatterings of brilliant dust among them, suggesting the wakes of winged starships. But past the starboard yardarms all this quick glorious scintillation of planet and meteor, of fixed stars, and the Magellanic clouds, with the beautiful cross sweetly dominant, went wan and dying into mere faintness. This, however, I did not particularly heed, though the habits of a sailor would cause me to fasten my eye upon the appearance. But presently looking for the crimson scar of bush-fire, I found it was gone with many of the stars which had been glittering above and against it. A few minutes put an end to conjecture. 'Twas a true South African fog coming along, white as gunpowder smoke, and eating out the prospect with long feelers and winding limbs till the whole body was fluffing thick and soft as feathers about the ship, eclipsing everything save a golden spike or two of the lighted lantern that hung against the mainmast. Chapter 45 of the Death Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Death Ship by William Clark Russell. Chapter 45. My Poor Darling. It was 10 o'clock. For half an hour had I been sitting in the cabin alone, waiting for Vanderdecken to come below and go to bed. I heard the parrot angrily clawing about her cage to the chiming of the bell, as if impatient of the slowness of the strokes, and enraged by their disturbing notes. And when the last chime died out, she violently flapped her wings and cried with an edge of scream in the ordinary harshness of her voice, "Wie sind alt verdammt!" "Verdammt for you, you vile croaker," thought I, involuntarily clenching my fist as I looked towards her. Such another yell might bring Van Vogelaar out of his berth. But she was never again to utter that curse in my hearing. I went to the cabin door and found the thickness boiling black about the decks, not an outline visible, nothing to be seen but the lantern shine, dim as a glow-worm in the crystalline denseness. The clanking of the pump seemed to find 20 echoes in the great concealed fabric of round tops and square yards on high. How ghostly the stillness with which the brake was plied! You listened till your ear seemed in pain for the sound of a human laugh, the growl of a human voice. Whilst I stood looking into the thickness, Vanderdecken came down the quarter-deck ladder. The wet of the fog sparkled in his beard, and his fur cap glistened to the lamplight. He stood in the doorway and stared at me under his great heavy brows as though surprised and even startled to see me, then exclaimed, "Ah, I had forgotten you sleep in this cabin tonight. The lamp can be left alight, if you please." "If you please, mynheer," said I, with a note of careless indifference in my voice. In fact, I would rather have been in darkness, but it was my policy to seem as if his wishes were all the same to me, let them run as they would. "Tell Prins when he comes, it is my order he should leave the lamp burning," said he, speaking quietly, and in a manner that recalled my earliest impressions of him when he talked low lest he should disturb Imogene. He gave me a stiff bow and walked to his cabin. 5 minutes after arrived Prins. "'Tis the captain's wish," said I, in a low voice, "that the lamp should be kept alight." "Good, sir," he replied, imitating my soft speech. "It is for my convenience. I sleep here, as you know, that the pump may be less disturbing. Captain Vanderdecken is good enough to consult my comfort, but as the light is bright, pray dim it, Prins. That may be managed, I hope?" "Easily," he answered, and climbed upon the table to come at the lamp. "So," said he, turning down the mesh, "how is that here, Fenton?" "A little fainter yet, so. I thank you, Prins. Have you made an end of your work? I am in no hurry to lie down." He slipped off the table with a look round and said, "My work is finished here. You can take your rest at once for me." He yawned. "These African fogs make one gape. Good night, sir." "Good night, Prins." He halted in the doorway. "I will shut this door to keep the damp out," he said. I motioned with my hand as though bidding him shut it, which he did, and I was left alone. I wrapped Vanderdecken's large rich cloak about me, and stretched myself along the bench, using my arm as a pillow. I resolved to lie thus for at least half an hour, conceiving that this would be long enough to weary anyone who should take it into his head to watch me through the cabin window. As to Vanderdecken, I did not fear his seeing me whilst he kept his door closed. The bulkhead of his berth was thick and apparently seamless, and his door fitted into overlaps of the jambs for the exclusion of draughts of air after the fashion in old shipbuilding. I lay very quiet, hearkening to the dull beating of the pump and watching the clock, the great hand of which was just visible. When it came round so as to lie upon the quarter before the hour, I rose with the utmost stealth, arranging the cloak in such a fashion as to make the dark shape of it resemble a recumbent form, and holding my breath, stole on tiptoe to Imogene's cabin and pushed the door. It opened. I entered and pushed the door to again, and it jammed noiselessly upon the soft substance that had kept it closed before. Imogene sat on the side of her bed, that exactly resembled the bed in Vanderdecken's room which I have described. She was fully dressed, and had on a fur or sealskin cap, with flaps for the ears. A small silver lamp of a very ancient pattern hung from a hook in the great beam that traversed the ceiling of her cabin, but she had trimmed or depressed the mesh into a feeble gleam. The little door that led to the quarter gallery stood open. I kissed her cold forehead and whispered, "Are you ready?" "Yes." I held her hand whilst I could have counted 10, but found it steadier than mine. "Come, dearest," said I, and I stepped into the gallery. The fog put an intolerable blackness into the air, and the chill of it was like frost upon the flesh. But for the phosphorescence of the sea, which I had before lamented, I should not have been able to see the boat under the counter. As it was, the tweaking of the line to the rise and fall of the Death Ship kept a small stir of water about the boat. The greenish-yellow shining showed through the fog and threw out the figure of the structure. The railing of the gallery rose to the height of my breast. I leaned over it, waving my hand in the blackness for the rope, and, not catching it, bade Imogene seize my coat to steady me, and jumped onto the rail, and in a moment felt the line and grasped it, then dismounted, holding the rope. In a few seconds I had the boat's head, that was square and horned, as you will remember, fair under the gallery, and in that posture I secured her by hitching the slack of the line to the rail. Everything continued to help us. First the fog, that made an astonishing blackness of the night, though I guessed this would grow into a pallid faintness presently, when the moon was up and had gathered power. Next, the phosphoric shinings upon which the boat rose and fell like a great blot of ink. Then the noise of the pump, which, to the most attentive ear on deck, would absorb all such feeble sounds as our movements were likely to cause. And again, there was the small but constant grinding of the sudden jumping of the rudder to the action of the swell, very nicely calculated to lull the suspicions of Vanderdecken in the adjacent cabin should he be awake and hear us. But this I did not fear, for the quarter gallery was outside the ship, and we worked in the open air, and made no noise besides. Not a moment was to be lost. The halyards I had unrove from the mizzen peak lay in a heap at my feet. I ran the length through, doubled it, and made a bowline on the bight of the two thicknesses. This bight or loop I slipped over Imogene's shoulders, bringing the running or lowering part in front of her, that there should be no pressure to hurt her tender breasts, and then took 2 turns round a stanchion on the quarter gallery. "Dearest," I whispered, kissing her, "keep a stout heart and do exactly as I bid. First, in what part of the cabin shall I find the pitcher and the provisions?" "Between the foot of the bedstead and the door. They are covered with a dress." "Right. I am now about to lower you into the boat. I will lower very gently. The moment your feet touch the boat, cough, but not loudly, as a sign for me to lower handsomely, for the rise and fall of the boat necessitates smart action. When you are safe, that is, When you are gotten into the middle of the boat, sit down and throw the rope off you. I will then send down the pitcher and bags by the line which you will cast adrift from them. It will then be my turn to join you." So saying, I took her in my arms and lifted her on to the rail, seating her there an instant. Then, taking in one hand the end of the rope which was twisted round the stanchion, with the other I gently slided her over the rail, easing her down with my arm round her till she hung by the line. In another moment she was in the boat. I hauled up the line, went for the pitcher and bags, and sent them down to her, she receiving and detaching them from the line with a promptitude equal to anything I could have hoped to find in that way in a sailor. I called to her softly, that she might know why I lingered. "I am going for the cloak." For the moment I saw it, I had made up my mind to carry it off as a covering for Imogene. I opened her cabin door breathlessly and peered out, then stole soft as a mouse to the cloak and threw it over my arm. The interior lay in a sullen gloom to the dim shining of the lamp. Our stock of provisions was small, and my eye catching sight of the chest under the table, I recollected having seen Prins put a canvas bag full of biscuit into it after supper. This I resolved to take. So I went to the chest, raised the lid, and found the bag. But, my hurry and agitation being great, I let fall the lid, which dropped with a noisy bang. Heaping curses upon my clumsiness, I fled like a deer into the cabin and on to the quarter-gallery, threw the cloak and bag into the boat, and followed headlong down the rope I had left dangling from the rail. I was scarce arrived when the faint light that streamed from Imogene's berth into the quarter-gallery was obscured, and to my horror I saw the loom of a human shape overhanging the rail. "Imogene! Imogene! Come back! Come back!" rang out Vanderdecken's deep and thrilling voice. "Heer Fenton, restore to me the treasure thou wouldst rob me of, and I swear not a single hair of thy head shall be harmed." In mad haste I sawed through the rope that held the boat with my pocket-knife. He could not see, but he heard me, and springing onto the rail, roared in his thunderous notes, "Arrants! Arrants! The Englishman hath seized one of the boats and is kidnapping Miss Dudley. Do you hear me? Speak, or you swing." I heard the clattering of heavy boots running along the tall, echoing poop high over our heads. "Sir, sir, I am here. Your orders, sir," bawled Arrants. Again roared out Vanderdecken, in a hurricane note fit to awaken the echoes of the inland mountains. "The Englishman is kidnapping Miss Dudley and hath already seized the larger boat. Send the men from the pump to man the other boat." "No, by heaven you don't," I shouted, mad with the excitement of the minute. The line that held us was severed. The boat's head swung round. I leaned half my length over the gunwale, caught the other boat, and severed the rope that secured her to the ship. Then, in a frenzy of haste, tumbled a couple of oars over and pulled away. But I had not measured 5 boats' lengths when the fog in which the ship, even at that short distance, lay completely swallowed, was gashed and rent by a blaze of red fire. The explosion of a musket followed. I knew by the flame leaping out of the quarter-gallery that it was Vanderdecken who had fired, and with set teeth strained with all my might at the oars. A dead stillness reigned. The clanking of the chains had ceased. I could hear nothing but the grind of the oars in the pins, and the sound of the water seething to the unnatural vigor with which I rowed. After a little I paused to gather from the noise of the surf how the boat headed. I bent my ear and found that the boiling was on my left. "How does it strike you, Imogene?" I asked in a broken voice, being terribly distressed for breath. She answered very low, "The sound is on your left." "That should signify," said I, "that we are heading out to sea. The breakers are heavy in the west, and 'tis down there the noise of them seems greatest. We must head right out, or this bay will prove worse than a rat trap." As I spoke, I heard the scattering reports of some 6 or 8 muskets discharged one after another, but the glare of the explosions was absorbed by the fog. "Ha!" cried I, "they shoot in hope." I fell to rowing again, and held to the weighty job stoutly for a good quarter of an hour. Weighty it was, for not only was the boat extremely cumbrous about the bows, if one square end of her more than another could be so termed, the oars were heavy, the blades being spoon-shaped, though flat, and the harder to work not only for the breadth of the boat, but because of the pins being fixed too far abaft the seats. I had now not much fear of being chased. Even if they found the boat I had liberated by sending men overboard to swim in search of it, there was movement enough in the water to glide it very swiftly into obscurity. I did not apprehend they would venture to pursue me in so great a fog. I threw in my oars and listened. A faint air stirred in the blackness, and if I was correct in supposing that we were heading seawards, then this draught was coming about southeast. The sound of the surf was like a weak rumbling of thunder. I strained my hearing to the right, that is, to starboard, for I sat with my back to the bows, but though indeed I could catch a faint, far-off moan of washing waters that way, the noise of the boiling was on our left. "I am sure we are out of the bay," said I. "Were we penetrating it, we should be by this time among the breakers. I heartily pray now this fog will soon thin out. It may whiten into something like light when the moon rides high. There is a faint wind, and I should be glad to step the mast and set the sail. But that isn't to be done by feeling. Besides, there is no rudder, and what there may be in the stern to steady an oar with I cannot conceive." I paused, thinking she would speak. Finding she was silent and fearing her to be cold and low-hearted, I said, "My dearest, you will gain confidence with the light. Meanwhile, we have good reason to be grateful for this blackness. They might have killed us, could they have seen the boat, for they were prompt with their firearms." "Geoffrey, dear," she exclaimed in the same low voice I had before noticed in her, "I fear I am wounded." "Wounded!" I shrieked, springing to my feet. "The instant Vanderdecken fired, if it was he," she continued, "I felt a stinging blow in my shoulder. I am very cold just there. I am bleeding, I believe." "Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" I cried, for now she spoke at some little length. I could hear in her voice the pain she was in, and the feebleness of her voice was like to break my heart, as was the thought of her suffering and bleeding in silence until I had rowed the boat a long distance from the ship. I felt for her and took her in my arms, but the shiver that ran through her warned me that my caress increased her pain. I would have given 10 years of my life for a light. 'Twas maddening to have to sit in such blackness, with nothing but a dim star or two of the green sea glow rising with the invisible heave of the water to the gunwale for the eye to rest upon, and to think of my precious one bleeding, perhaps wounded to death, utterly concealed from me, so that I could not staunch her wound nor comfort her, except by speech, nor help her in any way. 'Twas the doing of Vanderdecken, the murderer. Oh, why, when there was all the wide black air for the shot to whistle through, had it struck my life, my love, the darling whom I had snatched to my heart from the huge desolation of the deep, and from the horrible companionship of beings accursed of God? I groped about for the cloak I had flung into the boat, and found it. I made a bed of it, and pulling off my jacket, rolled it up into a pillow. I felt for her again, and told her that the bleeding might lessen if she would lie down. She answered, "I will lie down, dearest." I took her in my arms very tenderly and carefully, and laid her upon the cloak with the wounded shoulder uppermost, covered her as far as the skirts of the cloak would suffer, and chafed her hands. I was in so great a confusion and agony of mind that had I heard the dip of the oars astern and knew Vanderdecken was after me in the other boat, I should not have let go her hand. I could not have stirred from my kneeling posture beside her to help myself. But now that we were out of the bay, as I might be sure by the sound of the surf, I knew that our keel would be in the grip of the westerly current, and that whether I rowed or not, every hour must increase our distance from the Death Ship and improve our prospect of escape. I asked her if she was thirsty, understanding how quickly wounded persons crave in this direction. She answered no, but, as I believed, out of the sweetness of her heart, to save me anguish by any kind of confession of suffering beyond what she had already owned to. Believing her to be bleeding all the time, I held her hand in constant expectation of feeling it frosted and turning heavy with death. The sea, in its mighty life of 1,000 centuries, has upborne many dismal and affrighting pictures to the chill eye of the moon, to the fiery inspection of the sun, to the blindness of the cloud-blackened sky, but none worse than what our boat made, no torments direr than what I suffered. I could not see her face to observe whether she smiled upon me or not. The love in her eyes was hidden from me, and my heart could take no comfort from imagination when, for all I knew, the glazing of approaching dissolution might have iced those liquid, violet, impassioned depths into an unmeaning stare. Add to her lying in the blackness, wounded and bleeding, add to the anguish with which I probed the ebon smother for the merest glimpse of her, till my eyes burned like red-hot balls of fire under my brows. Add to this those elements of mystery, of horror, which entered into and created that black, sightless time, the desolate thunder of surf, defining to the ear the leagues and leagues of savage coast, a swarm with roaring beasts, with hissing reptiles, with creatures in human form fiercer and of crueler instincts than either, the magnitude of the ocean on whose breathing breast our tiny bark lay rocking, the wondrous darkness of the deep shadow of the fog upon the natural gloom of the night, the commingling of sullen and mysterious tones in the sulky obscurity, notes that seemed to come out of the seaward infinity, that seemed to rise from each swinging, respiring fold under us in voiceless sound that made you think of a moody conscience in some laboring breast, troubling the ear of imagination with mutterings whose audibility was that of the inarticulate. Chapter 46 of The Death Ship. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Death Ship by William Clark Russell. Chapter 46. I Am Alone. It was about midnight, as I was able presently to gather, when a sort of paleness entered into the fog, and hard upon the heels of this change, the air that had been weakly breathing briskened somewhat, fetching a deeper echo from the booming roll of the surf on the starboard side, and the water came to the boat in a shivering phosphoric light of ripples that set her a-dabbling. The light brightening, that is, the fog growing more luminous without appearing to thin, the boat's outline lay visible, together with her furniture, such as the sail and the oars. I tenderly laid Imogene's cold hand down, and turning the sail over, found, as I had expected, the mast lying under it, and partly peering and partly groping, I made out an iron clamp fitted to the foremost thwart or seat, with an hollow under it in the bottom of the boat for receiving the heel of the mast. I lifted the spar and very easily stepped it, discovering that the halyards for hoisting the sail were ready rove through a small block seized to the head of the mast. I hauled upon this rope to clear the sail, and perceived it to be shaped like a lug, fitted to a yard, only the yard was arched, causing the head of the sail to appear like a bow when the arrow is drawn upon it. Before setting the sail I went aft, and by dint of feeling and staring discovered a rope grummet or hempen hook fastened to the larboard horn, but close in so that it lay out of sight against the boat's stern. 'Twas very clear that this was meant to receive an oar for steering, but whether or not, it would serve my turn for that purpose. So, without more ado, I rove an oar through the grummet, then hoisted the sail, making the tack fast to the larboard horn on the bow, and came aft with the sheet. The boat instantly felt the pressure, and the wind being abaft the beam, she slipped along like a sledge, as you will suppose when I say that her bottom was shaped like the side of a pea-shell, and that her whole frame might have been imitated from one of those black pods of seaweed which are furnished by nature with wire-like projections, and which may be found in plenty upon our sea-coast. The oar controlled her capitally. The double motive I had for getting away from this place: first, to run out of the fog and so get light to enable me to minister to Imogene, and next to remove myself so far from the Death Ship as to render pursuit hopeless, even should the thickness in the bay clear up and enable Vanderdecken to recover his boat, which I had cut adrift. This double motive, I say, lifted my anxiety and eagerness to the height of madness. My dearest lay with her head towards me, and in the glistening white obscurity I could discern her pale face upon the pillow of my coat, but could not tell whether her eyes were open or shut. She did not moan. She lay as still as the dead. I asked her if she was in pain. She said, "No," but in a voice so feeble that I had to bend my ear to catch the syllable. I could not think of her but as slowly dying to the streaming away of her precious blood. What to do I knew not, and in addition to this dreadful state of despair was the obligation upon me to watch the boat and shrewdly and seriously attend to my course by the warning surf thunder floating back against the wind from the echoing strand. From time to time I would address Imogene, always with a terror in me of winning no reply, of touching her and finding her dead. Once she answered that she believed the bleeding in her shoulder had stopped, the icy coldness was gone, and there was a small smarting there as if she had been burnt, but nothing that she could not easily endure. But I knew by the tone of her voice that she spoke only to give me comfort, either that she was suffering above the power of her love for me to conceal in her faltering whispers, or that her strength was unequal to the labor of utterance. Yet, as I have said, what could I do? I was no chirurgeon. and I wonder that my heart did not break to the bending of my scorching eyes upon my love lying wounded and bleeding at my feet. An hour passed. The fog still compassed us, but the white splendor of the moon was upon it. Methought that I heard Imogene whisper. I dropped on my knee, and she asked for water. I let go the steering oar, that jammed in the grummet, and that could not therefore go adrift, and with great trouble found the little cup that I had hidden in one of the bags, and poured some water out of the pitcher into it. She moaned in pain when I put my arm under her head to raise it, but she drank greedily, nevertheless, and thanked me in a whisper when I tenderly let sink her head onto the jacket. I resumed my place at the oar, and through the blackness drove the boat, the sail pulling briskly, the water shining very brightly in our wake, and, as my ear seemed to fancy, the noise of the surf dwindling somewhat, whence I conjectured we were hauling off the coast, and standing more directly seawards. I do not know that I should have been without hope for my beloved if it had not been for the haunting and blasting thought that nothing but misery could attend association with Vanderdecken and his doomed ship. It seemed to me now, though on board I had been too eager to escape with her, too wrapped up in my love for such consideration to occupy my mind, that nothing less than the death of one of us could expiate our involuntary and unhappy connection with the banned and fated craft. Ships that spoke her perished, often with all hands. Misfortunes pursued those who merely sighted her. What sort of death could the curse involve for one who had lived for years or for weeks in the monstrous fabric, who had conversed familiarly with her abhorred occupants, who had been admitted into close inspection of her secret life, beheld the enactment by Vanderdecken in his sleep of the impious and horrible drama of his Christ-defying wrath, eat of his bread, drank of his cup, yea, and hearkened with sympathy to his talk of home, to his yearning speech concerning those he loved there. Suddenly the fog broke up. It was then about 2:00. The vapor floated into league-long streaks, lunar-tinted here and there into an aerial mockery of the rainbow, and over the edge of one great steam-like body, the moon, with an ice-like, diamond splendor of radiance, looked down upon us out of a pool of black sky. The luster had something of the sharpness of daylight, only that the flooded pearl of it wore the complexion of death, all things showing out wan, and in that illumination the delicate gold of Imogene's hair melted into the extreme pallor of the forehead on which it stirred to the wind, and her lips were of the color of her cheeks, and her half-closed lids like wax. I let go the oar to kneel and look at her. She lay so still, with such unheeding eyes, that I made sure she was dead, and my brain reeled as though my heart had stopped. I said hoarsely and hollowly, "Imogene." The fringe of her eyelids trembled, and I marked a faint smile on her lips. "Dearest," cried I, "how is it with thee?" She returned no answer. I said, "I shall be able to see the wound now, and perhaps check the bleeding. I can cut the dress clear of the shoulder, and you need not stir." She exclaimed, but, my God, how feebly, "Dearest, let me lie as I am," speaking with a sort of sigh between each word. And then she added, "Kiss me." I pressed my lips to hers. They were cold as the mist that was passing away in wreaths and clouds. I saw how it was, and let her have her way. It would have been cruel to touch her with more than my lips. and even though I should have cut away her apparel to the wound and saw it, what could I do? Suppose the bleeding internal, the bullet lodged within, the lung touched or some artery severed. A wild feeling seized me. I felt that I must leap upon a seat and rave out madly, or my head would burst. The efforts to control myself left me trembling and weeping. I wiped from my brow the sweat that had leapt in drops there out of my weakness, and put my hand upon the oar afresh. The fog had settled away to leeward. It looked like a vast cliff of snow-covered ice, and the moonshine worked in it in shifting veins of delicate amber and dim steel blue. Out of it, trending a little to the south of west, rolled the loom of the dusky land. It died out in the showering haze of the moonlight, whence ran the dark sea-line to right astern of us, nothing in sight but the land growing out of the fog. Over the horizon the stars hung like dewdrops, giving back the glory of the central luminary and set twinkling by the wind. They soared in sparkling dust, rich with large jewels, till they died out in the cold silvering of the sky round about the moon. Twice my darling moaned for water. Each time she thanked me with a smile, but the mere task of swallowing seemed to rob her lips of the power of pronouncing words. The moon went down in the west towards the black line of land, and when it hung a rusty red over the ebon shadow under which trickled the blood-like flakes of its reflection, the dawn broke. For above an hour I had not been able to see Imogene, so faint had fallen the light of the westering orb, and for longer than that time had she neither moaned nor whispered nor stirred. I directed my burning eyes into the east for the sun, and when the pink of him was in the sky, ere yet his brow had levelled the first flashing beam of day, I looked at Imogene. I looked, and yet looked, then knelt. She was smiling, and by that I believed she lived. But when I peered into the half-closed lids, oh, great God! The sun flamed out of the sea in a leap then, and I sprang to my feet and cursed him with a scorching throat for finding me alone. The sequel to this extraordinary narrative must be told by another pen. On the morning of the 2nd day of October, 1796, the full-rigged ship Mary and James, bound from Tonquin to London, dropped anchor in Table Bay. She had scarcely swung to her cable when the gig was lowered, and her master, Captain William Thunder, a small bow-legged man with a fiery nose and a brown wig, entered her and was rowed ashore. He marched, or rather rolled, into the town, which in those days was formed of a mere handful of low-roofed, strongly built houses, and knocking at one of them, situated not a musket-shot distant from the grounds of the building of the Dutch East India Company, inquired for Mr. Van Stadens. The coloured slave or servant showed him into a parlour, and presently Mr. Van Stadens, an extremely corpulent Dutchman, entered. They talked a while of business, for Van Stadens was the South African agent for the owner of the Mary and James, and then said Captain Thunder, "Mr. Van Stadens, I'm going to tell you the most wonderful thing you ever heard in all your life." "By Gott, Toonder, and so shall you," replied Van Stadens. "See here," said the captain, polishing his forehead with so much energy that he unconsciously shifted his wig. "We were about 90 miles to the eastwards of Agulhas, the weather clear, the wind about south, a quiet breeze, the ship under all plain sail, and the second officer in charge of the deck, when a hand aloft sung out there was a vessel 3 points on the lee bow. When we had her in sight from the poop, and caught her fair in the glass, I was so much struck by the cut of her canvas, which was a lug, narrow in the head and secured to a yard more arched than either of my legs, that I bored down to see what was to be made of her by a close squint. "So," said Van Stadens, crossing his legs and putting his hands upon his waistcoat in a posture of prayer. "She proved to be a canoe or boat," continued Captain Thunder, "rounded at bottom like one of Crusoe's periaguas, with horns sticking out at each square end of her. She was, or I should say she had been, painted red inside. The blades of her oars, shaped like a Japanese fan, were also painted red. Her sail looked to be 100 years old. I never saw the like of such canvas. The most perfect description of its color, patches, texture, would have sounded an abominable lie to me if I hadn't viewed it myself." "So," said Van Stadens, nodding upon his 4 chins, which resembled layers of pale gutta percha, with the elastic properties of that stuff. "In fact," said Captain Thunder, "she was of the exact fashion of the boats you see in old Dutch paintings, ship's boats, I mean." "How old?" asked Van Stadens. 200 years old," said Captain Thunder. "Gut. Is dat der Fonder, Tunder?" "Not by all the distance from here to the top of Table Mountain, Mr. Van Stadens," answered the captain. "I said to the second mate, 'That's no natural boat, Mr. Swillig. If she belongs to the age in which she appears to have been built, she ought to have been powder or ooze 150 years ago. Can you make out anybody in her?' He said no, and argued with me that there was something unnatural about her, and recommended that we should haul to the wind again and appear as if we hadn't seen her. But my curiosity was tickled, and we stood on. Well, Mr. Van Stadens, we passed close, and what we saw fetched a groan out of every man that was looking, and brought our main topsail to the mast in the wink of a mosquito's eye, sir. A girl lay dead in the bottom of the boat. She looked beautiful in death. In life she must have been as lovely as the prettiest of the angels of God. But her dress! Why, Mr. Van Stadens, it belonged to the time the boat was built in. Aye, as I sit here to say it." The Dutchman shook his head. "You shall see it for yourself, sir. You shall see it for yourself," cried Captain Thunder with excitement. "We all said she had been floating about in that boat for 200 years, and was a dead saint, watched by the eye of God, and not to be corrupted as you and me would be. There were 3 Dagos in our crew, and when they saw her they crossed themselves. But that wasn't all, not nearly all. In the bows lay the figure of a seaman, an English sailor, dressed as my mate is. We thought he was dead too, till we lowered a boat, when on a sudden he lifted his head out of his arms and looked at us. There was a shine in his eye that showed us his wits were gone. Such a haggard face, Mr. Van Stadens, unshaven for weeks, and his hair all of a mat. Yet you saw he had been a handsome man, and was a young one too. Well, his being alive settled any hesitation I might have felt had they both been corpses. I sung out to my second mate to bring him aboard, and the girl's body also, proposing decent burial, but the sailor man wasn't to be coaxed out of the boat. He grinned with rage to Mr. Swillig's invitations, flung himself upon the girl's body, howling like a dog when my men boarded him, and caused such a scuffle and a melee that both boats came very near to being swamped. They bound him with the painter, and brought him and the corpse on board, along with 3 bags of provisions. Such bags, Mr. Van Stadens, and such provisions, sir! But ye shall see 'em, ye shall see 'em, and a pitcher half full of water, and a silver cup." "Eh?" grumbled Van Stadens. "A silver cup." "So," said the Dutchman, Now we come to the funders. Aye, sir, as you say. Look here. He pulled a ring out of his waistcoat pocket and held it up. It was a diamond ring of splendor and beauty. The gems flashed gloriously, and Van Stadens gaped at their brilliance like a wolf yawning at the moon. "Where got you that, Thunder?" "Off the girl's finger. 'Tis but one, Mr. Van Stadens." "But one, hey, by thunder, Thunder! But that ring is the wonderfulest part of your story as yet." He took it in his hand, and his eyes danced greedily to the sparkle of the beautiful bauble. "Well," continued Captain Thunder, "we put the man into a spare cabin, and gave the job of watching him to the steward, a stout, hearty fellow. The girl was stone dead, of course. I ordered her dress, jacket, and hat to be removed, likewise the jewelry about her, specially a noble rope of pearls." "By thunder, no! You shook, Thunder!" cried Van Stadens. "Ye shall see with your own eyes, ye shall see with your own eyes," exclaimed the captain. "I gave these orders more with the idea of the things proving of use to identify her by than for their value. I never saw such underlinen, sir. 'Twas exquisitely fine and choice, beyond description, Mr. Van Stadens. There was a ball wound in her shoulder, with a caking of blood about it. That the fellow below had done this thing I could not suppose. There were no arms of any kind, if you except a big clasp knife, on him or in his boat. We buried the poor sweet murdered thing in her fine linen, giving her a sailor's hammock for a coffin, and a sailor's toss for a last farewell. As for the boat, she looked unnatural and unlucky, and I think my men would have mutinied if I had ordered them to sling her over the side. We unstepped the mast and sent her adrift for the man she belongs to pick up, if so be he stands in need of her." "What man?" inquired Van Stadens. "Vanderdecken," responded Captain Thunder in a low voice, and with as much awe in his face as his fiery pimple of a nose would suffer to appear. "What?" shouted Van Stadens. "The Flying Deutschman?" Captain Thunder nodded. The other smiled and then broke into a roar of laughter. "Hark, Mr. Van Stadens, wait till I've done!" exclaimed Thunder, with his face full of blood. All that day the man remained moody, with a lunatic sullenness. He refused to eat or drink. I was in and out a dozen times, but couldn't get him to speak. Well, sir, at 9 o'clock in the night, the steward came and told me he was asleep. He was watched all night, but never stirred. All next night, and the day after that, and the night after that, sir, but he never stirred. For 60 hours he slept, Mr. Van Stadens, or may I not leave this room alive. And I thought he meant dying in that fashion. Then he awoke, sat up, and talked rationally. His mind had come back to him, and he was as sensible as you or me." "Well?" "Well, he fed and rested a bit, and then, feeling stronger, he told me his story." And here Captain Thunder repeated what is already known to the reader. Mr. Van Stadens listened with his fat face full of incredulity. "'Tis wonderful indeed," said he, "but it isn't true." "I believe every word of it," said Thunder. "Blast the Flying Dutchman! Who doubts him?" "Your sailor man is mad," said Van Stadens. "Oh, indeed," sneered Thunder. "Then account to me for the boat I saw him in, for his female companion lying dead of a gunshot wound, for this," said he, holding up the diamond ring, "and for other matters I'll show you when we get aboard." "We will go on board at once," cried Van Stadens. They repaired to the ship and found Geoffrey Fenton in the cabin. He looked haggard, weak, extremely sorrowful, but he was as sane as ever he had been at any time of his life. Thunder introduced Van Stadens, and to this Dutchman Fenton repeated his story, relating it so artlessly, with such minuteness of detail, above all, unconsciously using so many old-fashioned Dutch words which he had acquired from Vanderdecken, that the wonder in Van Stadens' face grew into a look of stupefaction. He muttered frequently, "Wonderful, wonderful, by thunder, amazing!" But the measure of Captain Thunder's triumph over the agent's incredulity was not full till the articles belonging to Fenton, for so they were regarded, were produced. Van Stadens examined the pearls, the rings which poor Imogene had worn, the silver goblet, the antique dress, jacket, and sealskin cap, Vanderdecken's velvet cloak, the pitcher, the articles of food which had been preserved. These things, I say, Van Stadens examined with mingled admiration and consternation, such as a man might feel to whom another exhibits a treasure he has sold his soul to the devil for. "Do you believe now?" cried Captain Thunder. "It is wonderful, it is wonderful," returned the Dutchman. "Do you go home with Thunder, Herr Fenton?" "No," said Thunder, "I am sorry. I dare not do it. The crew have got scent of the experiences of our friend here, and wouldn't sail with him for tenfold the value of the plate and silver in the Death Ship's hold." "I do not blame them," said Fenton, with a melancholy smile. "What I have proposed to Mr. Fenton is this, Mr. Van Stadens," said the captain. "You are a man of honour, and will see that right is done to this poor gentleman." "So," said Van Stadens. "Let these articles be sold," continued Thunder. "All but the diamond ring," interrupted Fenton. "All but the diamond ring," said the captain. "No one need know how they were obtained. Not a syllable of Mr. Fenton's story must be repeated, otherwise he'll get no ship to carry him home." Van Stadens turned to Fenton and said in Dutch, "I will buy these goods from you. Their value shall be assessed to our common satisfaction. Meanwhile, a room in my house itself, is at your service. Remain a while to recruit your strength, and I will secure you a passage to Amsterdam in the Indiaman that is due here about the end of this month." They shook hands, and half an hour later Fenton had taken leave of Captain Thunder and his ship. It is proper to say here that the hospitable but shrewd Dutchman gave Fenton $800 for the Vanderdecken relics, and when Fenton had sailed, sold them for 3,000 ducatoons, of 80 stivers each, after clearing some thousands of dollars by exhibiting them. The subsequent safe arrival of Geoffrey Fenton in Europe may be gathered from his narrative. Necessity forced him back to his old vocation, and he continued at sea, holding various important commands down to the age of 60. Among his papers is a curious note relating to the fate of the vessels which had encountered the Death Ship during the time to which his narrative refers. The Plymouth Snow, after speaking the Saracen, was never again heard of. The Saracen was lost on one of the islands of the Chagos archipelago, but her people were saved to a man by the boats. The Centaur, 3 days after sighting the Death Ship, was dismasted in a hurricane and struggled into Simon's Bay in a sinking condition. The fate of the French corsair is not known, but it is satisfactory to know that the James and Mary reached the Thames in safety after an uneventful passage. End of chapter 46. Recording by Linda Johnson.